everyone. Thank you for coming to our presentation, Holler If You Hear Me, the pedagogical fusion between visual text and restorative ciphers. And I'm Michele Agosto, and I'm here with my partner.
My name is Dr. Arash Daneshzadeh. I teach at the University of San Francisco. I'm also editor-in-chief of the Transformative Justice Journal, and I'm also the chair of Save the Kids from Incarceration, which is a nonprofit that works to dismantle the school-to-prison pipeline.
And my main role is a director of arts for the Buffalo Public Schools in the city of Buffalo in New York State. And I also have my own organization, Los Artistas del Barrio, which is a Latina, Latinx arts collaborative that we have here in Buffalo. And, you know, today we'd like to have a really good conversation about using ciphers and visual text in curriculum, working with our youth, especially our youth of color. We want you to take an opportunity to look at this image. This image was created by one of our young people in Buffalo, a young artist. You'll see her picture in a little bit. And it was based on a conversation about liberation, social justice, and using art to have these conversations about these types of issues. And what's interesting about this, it just brought me and Arash into a conversation about how do you humanize curriculum? How do you bring social justice issues into all kinds of curriculum? And I had shared with him, I had a conversation with a colleague of mine who had difficulty trying to understand how one would actually include this type of humanization or these social justice issues into her curriculum. So then Dr. Arash here, who has a math background, kind of jumped on that conversation. So Arash.
So just to dovetail on what Michele said, and by the way, it's such an honor to present at NCT every year. I've really enjoyed my time interacting with the audience here, so please feel free to reach out. I think it would be remiss not to mention that Michele is one of the most empathetic pedagogues that I know. So everything she does is infused by intercommunal, really pedagogy. So I really appreciate it, and I'm humbled to present with her. So just to dovetail on what Michele said, I was a math teacher for 8 years before I became a dean at a community college for a few years, and then and now I'm a professor at my university. And for that first decade when I taught math at the K-12 level, and by the way, the first 2 years I actually taught in juvenile hall, hence my acute interest in youth incarceration, really thinking about transformative justice, really thinking about transmogrifying what math means and the siloing of art, Michele's sort of realm or lane, if you will, just to put it colloquially, and math. Why can't these two realms meld together? And so I was using, as a hip hop aficionado, I actually teach a critical race theory and hip hop class called Critical Hip Hop Studies at USF. And I use, when I teach teachers, future teachers, I teach them about infusing art and infusing storytelling in how they tell math, because there are so many intercommunal and diasporic contributions to math, meaning there's parts of many cultures that have contributed to math, from the Mayans to the Mesopotamians. So really thinking about giving students a historical context of how numbers can be created to tell stories. Even right now, during our current sort of ennui of the coronavirus epidemic, people are using statistics to tell one version of what's either happening or not happening with the coronavirus. So I had students create rap songs to teach each other how to use graphing calculators. I had students use art to explain the contributions that the Hindus made to algebra. So this was something that was really getting students that historically weren't attending math and even cutting school to reach 40% higher for some of my students who were dropping out in terms of attendance in my class. And this isn't sort of a hubris or humble brag. I'm sharing this because my first principal that I had, who hired me as a math teacher, told me to stop doing so much art and do math, as if the two worlds couldn't collide and really create a synergy that allows students to express themselves, but also see how math is really intrapsychically is important to their lives and their future. So with that said, this is really important to think about how every sort of breadth of knowledge and curriculum can really help be a vector for storytelling.
And oops, it's not working. Oh, there we go. Sorry about that. So, so the idea of being in your lane and that piece, that transformative piece, really is highlighted with my own children. These are my two boys, and Arash really wanted me to include them because of the connection to the work that I do and what I, you kind of practice what you preach, right? And so these two wonderful, handsome young people are mine, and the one on the left, I believe the one on the left, the one with the big smile there is Anthony. And the one to the right, he's the artist, the visual artist. The one on the right is my musician. And the arts has helped both of them tremendously. But I really want to talk about Alexander, who's the one on the right, who has an IEP. He had some challenges throughout his academic career. And it was the use of music and understanding music and incorporating that kind of curriculum, having his teachers understand how music was important to him. And somehow they've integrated, I've been very blessed with teachers that understood that using that as a tool to have him grow and excel in his other academic areas has been huge. And so with that builds confidence and all these wonderful opportunities that you see here. And so I just kind of put this in there to show how, concentrating on these other avenues, these other lanes, like Arash talked about, the arts, right? Which is what I am an advocate, huge advocate for. And I believe there's power in the arts, there's magic in arts. It connects to their socio-emotional growth. It connects to their academic growth. It connects to their own personal confidence levels and their imprint in this world. They can make a difference through these kinds of things that are help them. And I just hope that having conversations about the importance of these kinds of things kind of pushes schools to rethink about the kinds of policies that they may be, deciding to share, for lack of a better word, with their teachers. That it's really important to keep the student-centeredness of curriculum alive. And through that, I believe, through the arts and other things are really important. So I don't know if there's something else you want to share about that, Arash, before I move on. Good, okay. So we put in a few quotes in here that we thought were powerful, and we're going to go through them really quickly. And the first one is by everyone who knows Pablo Picasso, so he's easy to talk about. And in a 1964 interview, he was quoted as saying, "Art washes away from the soul the dust of everyday life." And I love that quote because it really reminds me of my own children, and actually reminds me of me, that it was the art that allowed me to survive certain incidents in my life through schooling and through my own personal life, kind of pushed that away, and it kind of allowed me to rise above some challenges that I had and my own children have. And I think that's really important to highlight. And then the next one, I'm going to let Arash take the next one.
Yeah, and I just want to add before I explain this slide that how, when we think about the soul and sort of the essence of how students respond to what we say, there's always, what they hear isn't always what we mean, and what we say isn't always what they hear. So what I mean by that is, oftentimes art and expression is the barometer of whether we're getting through to them, to put it candidly. And so when we have a student like Alexander, who does have a passion and an intellectual vitality for art or music, it would be paramount and quite frankly remiss not to use that to connect to him, to have a barometer of where he's at intrapsychically. Is he engaged? Is he feeling it? Is he feeling disenfranchised? And so just to sort of segue, Paulo Freire, who's one of my, I would say, academic North Stars in the politics of education, which is actually a book that I require all of my graduate students in my community organizing class called Community Cultural Wealth. They read it, and there's a quote that I share. This is a slide from one of my classes where he said in 1985, a radical pedagogy requires non-authoritarian social relationships that support dialogue and communication as indispensable for questioning the meaning and nature of knowledge and the peeling away of the hidden structures of reality. So oftentimes when we're teaching, we get into the sort of the minutia, the granular details of the curriculum, the formulas, where the formulas came from, the exponential growth of a factor, and really thinking about how we can modify a formula rather than thinking about how this applies in a very civic oriented way. And again, going back to the idea of social relationships between art and society, between math and society. And I will give an example at the end of our presentation about how art and math actually were used in a very intercommunal, as Huey P. Newton said in his book, Revolutionary Suicide, how art and math can actually be infused to create urban garden projects in places that are being, quite frankly, gentrified, like my community in Oakland and San Francisco. So the hidden curriculum is really juxtaposed with like test questions. So for example, we want our students to be able to contextualize what we hear. So an example is when we're norm referencing a standardized test, right? Standardized tests as a preface never say, like an SAT or ACT, never say choose the correct answer, which is why a lot of universities, including my own and my alma mater, Stanford, have actually disbanded the use of the ACT and SAT. They're not required anymore. Michelle and I were literally just talking about this yesterday because their son's applying to schools, and we're gonna burn sage. You're gonna get into all of them, but yeah. So when they say choose the best answer, there's a normative, quite frankly, Anglo-normative, quite frankly, white supremacist undergirding, and a capitalistic undergirding, and a gender normative undergirding of all these questions. Here's an example. If I said, Kathleen, or I'll choose a very stereotypical white, Karen or Becky, sleep in a bed, a yacht, a car, a sidewalk, what would be the correct answer, right? There are people who sleep on sidewalks. There are people who sleep on yachts. There are people who sleep in beds. But what would be the best answer? Michelle, what do you think the correct answer would be in terms of choosing the best one?
I would say beds.
Right. There's no such thing as a politically neutral classroom. Henceforth, there's no such thing as a politically neutral standardized question. For a student, and Claude Steele, who was one of my mentors at Stanford, and before he left us to Berkeley, and you know, he created this concept of stereotype threat. So if you say Karen sleeps in a bed, what if you change the song? And he talks about this in his book, Whistling Vivaldi, which I highly recommend. He said, what if you change the name Karen or Becky to Arash or Jamal or Jamil or Latavius, something stereotypically ethnic, right? Would you still say bed? And chances are, and they've done qualitative studies, double blind studies, where participants have said, no, that person probably doesn't sleep in a bed. So I actually had a student named April, where the first time she slept in a bed was in her freshman dorm at UC Santa Cruz, because she slept in her mom's car. She was homeless her junior and senior year of high school and didn't tell any of us. So for her, she's compelled to choose bed because she knows how test questions are Anglo-normative. Imagine if we can teach our students in history classes, art classes, math classes, how the system is rigged. And when they learn that, they can use art and math to, quite frankly, create a critical, again, to put it colloquially, clapback, right? Neutrality is itself a political choice that is made by a transactional model of education. And that bolsters the status quo. So what results is a classroom that ignores the fears, interests, and concerns of students. So this idea of radical education, it's a long-held view that there's a stark contrast between creating a safe space where we just teach formulas and how to draw straight lines and coloring between the lines, and a classroom that creates a politically neutral one. So in this research and in this workshop, what we're going to do is really provide a new context in which visual text intersects with hip-hop centered restorative justice, and I'll explain what that means later, known as a tier 1 restorative cipher. And we use visual text as a tool within that cipher.
And that leads beautifully to this next quote, which is by 2 Chainz in 2012. And he says, I encourage everyone to pay attention to the issues that matter to you, from jobs and the economy to education in our schools to criminal justice reform. Whatever it is that you care about, make sure you use your voice. And so, you know, we ask you, you know, what does that mean? What constitutes voice? You know, and how do we use voice? And so, you know, is it only a class time thing? Is it beyond class? Is it, you know, how do you encourage children to use their voice? And what does that mean to you? And so we kind of leave that and pose that question to we move on to the next slide. And that's yours.
So Dr. Joyce King, who's is a full professor at Georgia State University. I think she's emeritus now, but she's, again, one of my intellectual heroes. She came up with this idea of disconscious racism, which is this idea where in an effort to create racially neutral or politically neutral classrooms are actually devoid of opportunities for students to share that proverbial or veritable voice, because the classroom is so focused on the technocratic aspect of the curriculum, how to draw straight lines, how to create, you know, the Bob Ross perfect clouds, where the Pythagorean theorem came from, that we're not creating opportunities where we can explain how slavery was actually a capitalistic endeavor that exponentially grew the wealth of capitalists in the colonial era. And that epoch led to the Ivy League schools that were actually built by enslaved Africans. Imagine if art and math and social science created opportunities to see how we live in the afterlife of slavery, but how we can really create opportunities for students to chronologically and genealogically tell the story of the United States through the curriculum, rather than focusing on doing the work, making the work be a bridge between who we are as a society and where we'd like to be. And so this conscious racism is really defined as sort of the existential contradiction of teaching. So we have to, as teachers, also be students. I don't expect all the participants on this video to be hip hop heads. I don't expect people to be ethnic studies professors. I don't expect you to understand how the Latinx diaspora is paramount to the economy of the United States. What I do expect is that teachers are humble enough to also be students. Otherwise, we end up perpetuating that which we purport to subvert, which is this idea of disconscious racism, which is, again, this idea where we are, as adults and pedagogues, the experts, and students can't actually bilaterally inform us, and where we could actually create feedback loops where students like Alexander through his music, or students like Anthony through his art, can actually tell us where they're at, how they're receiving the curriculum, and we can take that art and then again re-engage ourselves as facilitators in the classroom.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So I'm going to jump into some informations. I thought it'd be really helpful for you to understand where I come from, my district comes from, and just sharing some of the data that I think is really important. So we are the second largest district in New York State, and we have an enrollment of almost close to 34,000 children. If you can look at the district data as far as the demographics, we've stayed steady at the Latino student enrollment. We had an uptick of young children coming from Puerto Rico because of Hurricane Maria last year, but it stayed steady this year. You can also see where we have half of our students are Black students, Black youth. And you can see where the multiracial, that's starting to grow also. It's interesting that I think it's probably lower, depends on what people identify with. So we may have multiracial kids who still identify as Black, or multiracial kids that identify as Latino. And so that's where they kind of sit. So that's kind of our students. And I also wanted to share the kind of the diverse languages that we speak in the district. And we have several languages, Spanish being the highest rated, but we have a large community of young people who speak Arabic, and then Korean and Somali, going down to Bengali. But we have several other languages, and we actually have about 70 languages that are spoken, or students that speak 70 languages in the district. So we have a very diverse community in our schools. And here's some information that shows you our graduation rates. So we have grown. It's not anywhere near where we want to be, but there was a point in my career that we were at a low of 45% graduation, and it was horrifying. And where you can see it's steady. It started growing around 2015. That's really significant for our district because it was about that time that we started looking at disproportionality and the kinds of policies that were in place that were obviously racist in a lot of ways. And so we really looked at what we were doing and started making some changes that I'll talk about in a few. And you can see steadily the graduation rate has gone up. Still, again, nowhere where we need it to be, but it is going in the right direction. So we are proud of that, though, you know, there is work to be done. And here I wanted to share this with you, and mostly just for you to kind of give it a good look at. You're going to see on one side the enrollment percentage and then the percentage of suspensions. And you're going to see the number of students on one side and the number of students on the right side, that 4760, which is the total number of suspensions. And I'd like you to look at the four top groups, demographics here, the Black, White, Latino, and Asian. And no, I don't think I need to spell it out for you. There's some disparity here. There's some obvious ramification of policies that have been unfair to our young people of color, and it's coming through these suspension rates. And so we look at this. This is something that sometimes is hard for a district to look at. You know, you see numbers and you forget that they're connected to kids. And we have been really working hard with our district, and not just central office, not just district staff, not just administration, but with teachers, about what these numbers really mean and how their practices and whether or not they mean them or not, whether they're implicit or not, how their practices have hurt children. And so this is a conversation, an ongoing conversation that we have in the district, and we've been really open. It's been very difficult. And it's been, we're on, like I said, we're in our 5th year. So now the conversations have become a bit more easier on the ears for people, I guess, if I can say that. When we started this work, it was, there were a lot of angry people. You know, when we had this conversation, teachers are not pleased because, you know, the reality hits hard. And so, but we're growing steadily, and we can see the change, obviously, with those graduation rates. Oh, that was slow. Let's see, I don't know why that happened, but we'll go on to the next one. This here, I wanted to share with you before we moved on to the crux of our presentation, is just a citation that we had in 2016. New York State Education Department was charged NYU with overseeing our practices and our policies in the district. And it was obvious that we were classifying children that shouldn't have been classified in special education. There were children who were being suspended at rates that were unfair, our children of color. We had, you know, here, Latino students, the disproportionality of suspension as to enrollment was really obvious. And so this is just here for you to see that we were cited. And even in 2015, when we started the work, wasn't good enough. And we had to get the state to actually say, you need to do something about this in a serious way, and we did. And so you can see we were charged with making some changes in the district. And so one of the things that we started talking, and this is the young lady who created that first image in the presentation, and I love her. She graduated, she's off doing great, wonderful things. But and she's at UB actually, so she's a proud UB. But she talked about this piece with me, and it was with pride, and it was just not just talking about the piece, but it was talking about why she did the piece. And I think that is that critical piece, that critical thinking, that inquiry that we want to develop in children. We want them to think about what they're doing, not just create something, not just write something, not just to put a formula together and get the math right on it. We want them to think about making connections that are important to them. And so it was a joy talking to her about this artwork. But in the district, we were asked, all of our departments were asked to start really thinking about curriculum and about the kind of outcomes that we wanted our students to leave our departments with at the end of 12th grade. And whether or not some of the policies, district-wide, school-wide, department-wide, were perpetuating bias and causing disparities between our students. And so the BPS were really aggressive about approaching this idea of disproportionality, which, to be honest with you, in 2015 and 16, teachers didn't understand what that was. So there was a huge learning curve about what is this disproportionality and why is it important and why is it that we're the ones that are causing that. It's not the students really, it's us, right, that are causing that, causing these issues. And so while we were all charged with that, I'm in charge of the Department of Art. So I want to share with you what we did to kind of approach this problem and to find a way to use the arts as a tool for teachers and for students through art making to build relationships, to build community, to be able to have open and trusting opportunities to talk about things that are important to young people. And so that's what we're going to talk about. And so in the district, there were 5 high-level strategies that we started with in 2016. They were creating a welcoming environment. They were creating instruction that was rigorous and to have high expectations for all our students. They were certainly to be much more culturally inclusive in our curriculum and to offer professional development to teachers and administrators about what culturally responsive teaching is. And so this brings me to the visual text. And so you're going to see a lot of images because in our state standards and in national standards, imagery is text. And so, you know, visual imagery can be used to share a story. They are text and they are part of the Common Core. And we make sure to make that well known to everyone in our district, because we want kids to be able to utilize whatever forms of text is available to them that for them to express themselves. It's really important. And so this is our response to disproportionality. And so what is visual text? A visual text is a careful construction by the artist, and that means the young person who is the artist, that person, to shape meaning and to influence the viewer emotionally, cognitively, spiritually, and physically. So it's actually quite an empowering thing, visual text. The young person, the artist, has the ability to enact and shape meaning and change through their own work. So whoever views that hopefully can interpret it the way that young person has created that piece and use that as a platform to talk about issues that are important to them. So I want to kind of go through a few great examples in our district. I am very involved with my teachers. I am very passionate about the work that I do. And so it has slowly seeped into the minds of my teachers. And they have taken a lot of leadership over this idea of visual text in the curriculum. And so I want to focus on just a few of my teachers, and I'll go through the images relatively quickly. We have a lot of slides. So this is how one of our schools, Frank A. Sadida, Academy Bilingual School number 30. It's a school that has, it's mostly bilingual, Spanish speaking, but we have students from all over the world that are housed in this particular school. And in this school, our teacher, her name is Amy Capizello, uses visual text to build, to help children build stories, to build confidence, to develop their English language skills, and to share their own personal stories in a safe place. And you hear a lot about that safe space, safe place. What does that mean? And I think we get into that a little bit. But in this particular school, having children build create visual journals is a safe space for our children. And these journals,
Michele,
yeah.
I was just gonna say, could you share a little bit, because one of the contentions that I get from teachers in NCT at the pass is, that's great, but assessment is such a, as you know, a huge part of how we grade. So could you share a little bit about when teachers were assessing these journal entries, how they were actually assessing and holding them accountable for what they had to do, what they
Sure,
were
of
looking
course.
for? Yeah.
Of course. Well, yes, and I'm going to do that. I want to maybe do that at the end of all of them because I think it'll just be easier. But I do, and if I forget, Arash, let me know. But yes, I will definitely talk about that. So these are visual journals, and visual journals are encouraged in every child should have a visual journal, and she does a great job with visual journals. Students create their own journals. They can create it from paper. If they don't know how to create one, we could give one to them. But we prefer having them create a visual journal because how they create it is also a reflection of their own thought and critical thinking. This one is really sweet because it's a young boy from Puerto Rico who has been in, I believe he was in the city of Buffalo for about 2.5, 3 years. And he talks about Puerto Rico, and I'll read it out loud because I think it's really adorable because he connects his being Puerto Rican and the things that were important to him in Puerto Rico with his new Boy Scout identity, which is adorable. And he said, Scout oath. On my honor, I will do my best to do my duty to God and my country and obey the Scout law to help other people at all times, to keep myself physically strong, mentally awake, and morally straight. And then he does a frog, an equals coqui, because that's what we call them in Puerto Rico. The little frogs are coquis. And I found this piece so interesting because that was something this is visual journal. This isn't a Boy Scout journal. This is his art journal. And that meant something to him. And he connected it in his own mind to his own personal identity as being a young Puerto Rican child, and this symbol, which has a lot of meaning in Puerto Rico. And he has that balance with his friendship bracelet and his picture of his new family in the Boy Scouts. I love that. I just love how he was able to do some, for me, this is intersectionality, right? Like he is putting this all together in a way that makes sense to him. And he's writing, right? This is a child who is ELL, who's developing English language skills and writing in English. He's writing, he's sharing his story, he's drawing an image that is important to him, and he's making these connections in a safe place, right? That makes him happy, and it describes him and empowers him and builds confidence in him. The next one is also, I'm going to go through these relatively quickly, and this one's really cool. This is about ruling the world, and if they could rule the world as a king, what they would do. And they're beautiful. Like you see that and you're like, oh no, what is this about? But then you see the rules, and the rules are everyone should learn art at least 2 or 3 times a week. I love that rule. It's my favorite rule here. No bullying, no matter where. We help each other. These are really amazing rules. Like if we could all follow these rules, the world would be a beautiful place, right? Rules that I should make are to the right, no jails, right?
Abolitionists. We got a
Right.
young abolitionist out here.
That's right.
Love it.
That's right. Cameras around the city. And I think he put that in there for safety, right? Wants to be safe, right? I just love this. There was another no bullying, helping each other. All these are wonderful things. These are what kids are thinking about. These things are important to them, you know? Um, so this is another one, number 5 on the left. Try or make sure you're not racist. It's supposed to be racist, right? By calling people skin color. These are kids, these are ELL kids, right? Kids with English language learners, learning how to write English, talking about things that are really important to them. So I love this. This is great. This is visual text. This is power. This is power for the children. This is power for the teacher. The teacher can get to know her kids or his kids, understand where they're coming from, and build curriculum around these kinds of things. The next, oh, this is a close-up. The next one is another student. Bumps on the road is life. Without them, life would be dull. And talking about, using this one. This one talks about someone stealing his journal and that he grieved. All his artwork was in it, and how he grieved. And it makes me so sad. But he got back on his feet, got another journal, and started doing it again. These small pieces of paper bound together are important to children. Here they can say and express things that often they're not allowed to do in other kinds of classes or social environments. And so these are really important. And you can see that they become very poetic a lot of the time. They start pulling words together in a way that are just amazing.
Can I add one thing, Michele?
Yeah, please.
Just please, is that okay?
Yeah, of course.
I just want to point out that
Mhm.
there's a common lament among many closeted racist teachers that I hear, where we have a deficit mindset of our students, where we think they aren't resilient because they whine and moan about assignments. And the last 3 students that Michele shared have had profoundly difficult upbringings.
Mhm.
And all 3 of them treated life like in the way that Krishnamurti or Deepak Chopra would. And the difference is that they had, again, we've belabored it, but a literal space that was sanctioned by the school that Cristina Gutierrez at UC Berkeley calls a third space. So the first space is the school that gives you grades and sanctions your behavior. The second space is your community that sanctions your behavior. You got rules at home. But she calls the third space that sort of intermediary space where your pedagogical space doesn't sanction your behavior. It allows you to share with your faculty what you're going through so that resilience can be demonstrated. So the next time a student is having trouble and maybe may whine or moan about something, teachers can put it in context and not make blanket statements, deficit-based statements about what a student can or can't handle, especially when you're not giving them opportunities like Michelle's teachers are doing in Buffalo to express that hardship. That in of itself is a form of decompression that is a precursor to being able to learn.
Mhm.
So imagine if you're hungry and you come to class, you're thinking about a burrito. You're not thinking about what.
Mhm.
So that's what this is for these students. There's almost like an emotional void that I feel like Buffalo teachers are trying to fill here with this opportunity. So
Yeah.
thank you,
Yeah.
Michele.
No, thank you for that. And it's totally on point. Um, you know, we actually, I know I'm so proud of my teachers for taking this on, because sometimes you see things that are like Arash said, these children, a lot of our children, we have a lot of refugee immigrant children have gone through things that we cannot even imagine, just cannot even imagine. We are, and when they have an opportunity to share that, because they want to, because it's a relief for them to share some of this. Someone's interested in what they have to say and they want to listen. It's not only just interested, but they want to listen, right? It's just beyond powerful. And that's where, we go back to this idea of visual text. It's the combination of words and images that allows children to safely and powerfully share what is most important about who they are, and gives them opportunity to say you can make a change, make a difference, and give them that place to formulate those ideas. This one, we talked about poetry, and this one is very poetic, and I do want to read this one. It's called Be Different Like Stargirl. If someone don't love you for you, that's their issue. Why change just to be it? Be your own kind of beautiful. If the person around you can't accept you, don't change yourself. Instead, change the person you're around with. She was exclusive. She was today. She was tomorrow. She was the faintest sense of cactus flower, the flighty shadow of an elf. We did not know what to make of her. In our mind, we had to pin her to corkboard like a butterfly, but the pin merely went through and away she flew. Ooh, that gave me chills. Like that is beautiful. That is a beautiful poem. And she was allowed to write this. Where else was she writing this? Where else was she thinking like this, you know? And to be different. And obviously she feels like she's different. And here she is, it is an empowerment to be different. So this is just a quote. We took some surveys of some of our teachers, some of our other teachers, our regular classroom teachers. We wanted to know what they thought of the growth of their students through these visual text, visual journals. And so this particular teacher says, as an urban public school educator, I've always believed that there is one way we have a significant advantage over our suburban counterparts. We have diversity, we have global presence every day in our classrooms. Our students bring culture, language, and experiences to the classrooms that cannot be measured in value. And New York State standards mandate cultural connections, and we have the ability to forge those relationships and connections in the most authentic manner. So yes, when I view the multicultural pieces of art that our students create, I feel a sense of unity. We are from different paths, different cultures, we have different histories, we are all afforded the ability to create beauty. And I love that, we are all afforded the ability to create beauty. I think that's really quite nice. And this is the art teacher who talks a little bit more about why culturally and linguistically responsive teaching is really important. And for me, culturally and linguistically relevant art teaching is a way of thinking and working. It's about meeting students where they are and with a genuine interest in learning about them as individuals with diverse cultural backgrounds. It's about creating personally, socially, and culturally relevant and provocative lessons. I love that, provocative lessons that prompt students to reflect on and learn more about themselves and their relationships with others through the world of art. The focus is on empowering students to become the best versions of themselves that they can be. And if you don't know them, you can't help them. So the strategies I will share are ones I do at the start of 2 of my college courses that could be used in pre-K through 12 art rooms as well. If you try one of these with your students, I'd love to hear from you. So she's reaching out to you. So if you ever try one of these, let us know. We'd love to share them with her. This is another teacher. This is high school. So those were our young children, elementary school students between 3rd and 5th grade. These are high school students. And this is also from a school that has a huge population of diverse students, immigrant and refugee students. And they have to learn about US history, you know, and global studies and US history. And in this particular one, they talk about FDR. And so this teacher pulls in the freedoms that were part of a speech FDR had in 1941, these 4 freedoms that were essential to American life, and uses them as prompts for our students. And this is super powerful because, again, not all of them, but a lot of our students who are immigrant and refugee students have had very difficult lives. And so these kind of prompts really put them in a place of, I don't know, they become so reflective about what this means, and they connected to what they lived, that the artwork and the visual text that you're going to see is just beyond what you're going to imagine. So she starts with these questions. How do FDR's 1941 freedoms apply to today's society? Are these freedoms an American idea, or can they be applied globally? And she shares a little CBSnews.com thing about Norman Rockwell we are in art, we're teaching art. So we talk about Norman Rockwell and his work. And so she makes all of these kinds of curricular connections. And so these are some of the pieces that our students came up with. This is freedom of religion. And I think if you're looking at it, you'll be able to really see how they've been able to interpret and integrate that concept into their artwork. And if you looked at their artwork, you'd be able to read this, I think, really clearly. This is visual text that is clear in its narrative. And so I think you can read that. I'm going to move on to the next one. Again, freedom from fear. And I'll give you a little bit of time to kind of read some of the writings on the right. So you can see what is happening in a child's mind and what they're thinking about. Where else do our young people have an opportunity to really express this kind of deep-seated internal anxiety about the world, right? And they do it with such, I don't know, detail, and it's hard to describe that these pieces are coming from young people, you know, but it's powerful. The next one is, again, freedom from fear. And here, if you can't see it, it says, I know you can't speak, with tears. And again, this one. So these are children who are not art students, right? These are children who take art, right? And the art teacher has taught them some basic skills, but more beyond that, they've explained and they've encouraged our young people to take what they're thinking and put that in paper and be able to create a narrative, create a story that is meaningful to them and that other people can interpret it. You know, that's where the power is too. You can see where this child is coming from. Next one here, freedom from want. Right? Kind of this interesting paradox here. And then another freedom from want. You can see words, food, and this is, I believe, the child's name. Freedom of expression, liberty, opinion. And so, you know, at the end of this, and I wish I have so much more to share, but, you know, we think using visual text is a primary strategy. It's a priority strategy. Let's forget about primary. It's a priority strategy for our students, right? To offer a safe space so that they can have choice, they can have voice, and they can improve student-teacher relationships. And it does so exponentially, because once you know where your students come from and you give them the opportunity to share that with you in a space without judgment, right? The kinds of relationships and the kinds of work that will develop beyond that is just, it's just going to be out of this world. So on that, this kind of goes right and dives into Arash's piece about our restorative justice. And so I'm going to let him take it over.
Thank you, Michele. And again, I think I speak for many of us. I'm just so grateful for Michele sharing such the vulnerable and candid pieces from her amazing students. And I just want to say that what is also very powerful about those, and Michele touched on this at the end of her presentation, is that these pieces provide an opportunity for dialectic between teachers and students where they may not have, depending on the subject matter. So if you're teaching about AP chemistry and you're teaching students about why the Flint water crisis in Michigan is so toxic, and you're talking to them about pH levels and all that, there's also an emotional response that students, particularly Black students, if we could keep it 100, are having to primarily Black communities in Flint, dealing with the toxic lead runoff that still, after 6 years, has not been rectified. And so they can share that emotional response through their art. Now, what's paramount, and something I always share with my teachers, is if you use visual text, there can't be a terminal velocity after the students do the artwork. There absolutely needs to be an opportunity for dialectic, right? Which Bakhtin in his book, Dialogical Imaginations, talks about. A true teacher that listens to student voice always offers an opportunity for students to continue that exchange. So once a student does an art piece, the conversation can't just stop there. It can't stop at, oh, I'm about to put this artwork in the Buffalo Art Gallery and we're done here. Now we can go back to our curriculum. It has to be an ongoing feedback loop. Otherwise, students are going to know that they're being tokenized. And that's when the disengagement happens. So my work, my dissertation work, the books that I've published, all my research is around restorative justice, which is sort of a faddish vanguard term. It's become very sexy in education. And quite frankly, it's been gentrified, which is why the title of my book is How Whiteness Stole Justice, which is essentially an attack on the white feminists in education that have taken the idea of restorative justice as we're going to restore Black and brown people, i.e., we're going to fix them. And it's because many people since 1965, when Daniel Moynihan was commissioned by Lyndon B. Johnson to write his seminal piece called The Negro Family, The Case for National Action, he created this concept of cultural poverty in the Black community. So the reason why students are disengaged in Black and brown communities and Native American communities, Daniel Patrick Moynihan said, who was actually not the Secretary of Education, he was the Secretary of Labor. Just want to point that out. He said it's because those families don't try hard. They're pathologically and intrapsychically in their own minds divested from the educational institution. Now, rather than Lyndon B. Johnson taking that study further, as a true researcher would, and saying, well, why are Black and brown communities disengaged from colleges that are predominantly white, or education systems that really ascribe to the faux exceptionalism of the U.S. American dream? You just sort of stop the research as there's a culture of poverty, and we have to essentially integrate, right? So we have to integrate students more into white schools. And so this study by Dr. Moynihan led to the busing of Black students from Detroit into like Lansing, and Black students from Oakland into areas like Berkeley and Piedmont, Black students from East Palo Alto into communities like San Mateo and the Peninsula in the Bay Area where I grew up. I am a refugee student. I'm one of 3 million children who came to the United States from a war-torn country. I had to apply for asylum. I lost both my brothers in the Iran-Iraq war. And so for me, restorative justice is not only an opportunity to share what my war-torn story was about, but an opportunity to really attack the imperialism of the country that made me a refugee. And if I can't do that, U.S. history don't mean jack to me. If I don't have an opportunity to talk about imperialism, white supremacy, the need for U.S. to invade countries for their oil, U.S. history was sort of a fomented lie. So for me, restorative justice isn't about restoring Arash's disengagement, but really just restoring what schooling means, where students are active stakeholders. And that's the difference between restorative justice, we're fixing Black and brown people, and transformative justice, which is we're fixing the ecological system that led to integration even being a necessity. Like, why do we have to bus kids to white schools for them to learn? Let's think about why we didn't allow Black teachers to teach Pan-African history. Let's have that conversation. And so that's also part of U.S. history. Why can't U.S. history teachers teach that? So what does restorative justice mean? Now that I gave you a mini TED Talk. Restorative justice has 3 terms according to the Restorative Justice Center in Oakland, which is the think tank where I did a lot of my study in my doctoral program. So there's 3 tiers, and essentially what I argue in my book, How Whiteness Stole Justice, is the tier that a lot of schools, including Buffalo, when I went, including Oakland Unified back in the early 2000s, subscribed to is 2 students get into a fight in the hallway. We're not going to think about what's going on at home. We're not going to think about how their teachers are treating them. We're not going to think about whether or not they're, like Michele said in the very beginning of her presentation, whether they should be in special education classes or not. whether they should have an IEP or not. Let's just get them in front of a counselor, mediate the fight, send them back to class. And the whole issue is sort of like we're fixing the symptom rather than the root cause, which Angela Davis says is the actual definition of radical pedagogy. That's tier 3. Tier 2 is restorative discipline, where students have to agree to a changed behavior and really sign a contract, and there's family conferencing, and you bring in coaches and family members into a circle that's usually facilitated by a leader in the school, usually a counselor, where students can then go back to class. Tier 1 is the only tier in the restorative justice tiers that is preemptive, proactive, and transformative. And that's what I've been trying to do with districts like Michele when I work with them, and a lot of districts where I've done my research in San Francisco and Oakland, and also Madison, Wisconsin, and Arizona. So what tier 1 is, this idea of, okay, so can we get a classroom that's taught in a lab model where community members and credentialed teachers can actually teach together? So there's sort of a community, or as Michele said, in a culturally inclusive way of teaching, right? Which is sort of the essence of visual text, is you're allowing students to tell their own story rather than sanctioning and dictating. So what does that actually look like? I know I just told a bevy of theory at you at 100 miles an hour, but what the hell is this Mesopotamian talking about? You know what I mean? So let's go to the next idea. So in my critical hip hop studies class, thank you, Michele, I talked to my students about why I fell in love with hip hop. And I always share a quick story with them, which is when I was in high school, I was in honors English class because I scored really high on a lot of my tests, even though English was my third language after Arabic and Farsi. And so I used to have my headphones in my ear and I listened to a lot of Wu-Tang and Pac. I'm totally carbon dating myself. I'm hella old. My teacher, who Dr. Halliday, I still remember her. She got her PhD. She used to come and take my headphones out, and she's like, "Stop listening to that rap. I'm trying to get you to listen to, write Chaucer." We were studying like, Canterbury Tales, which is so boring to me. And so on the California STAR test, I actually had to write a story about sort of my journey and sort of my coming to age moment when I thought of myself as a leader. And I actually quoted Elzai from Slum Village, if any of you know who Slum Village is, and Inspector Deck from Wu-Tang Clan, who were two of my favorite MCs growing up. But because I'm such a hip hop nerd, I used their actual government names, right? And so I said Jason Powers and Jason Hunter, which is Inspector Deck's name, I still remember this 20 years later. Oh shit, I just already said how old I am. But Inspector Deck, I said Jason Hunter, the famous urban philosopher, once said, "Life as a shorty shouldn't be so rough." And then I dovetailed to Jason Powers, who is a lyricist and a philosopher of urban gentrification, once said that public school is a glass house that the devil throws stones through. And Dr. Halliday was actually one of the graders of my essay. And she was like, "This is beautiful. We should incorporate their books into our classroom." And I'm like, they're actually not authors, they're lyricists, they're hip hop heads, they're lyricists, they're MCs. And after that, it completely changed her mindset. So that dovetails to my critical race theory class, where we talk about issues that can be problematic. MCs are absolutely problematic. They can be toxic masculine, they can be homophobic, they can be transphobic, they can even be colorist and self-hating racist themselves. But guess what? That's America. That's a mirror. So how can we use this art? How can we use the cover of albums to explicate and really have a dialogical response, meaning a back and forth with our students about what the hell's going on? So there's a rapper named Young Thug. He's wearing a purple dress with a samurai hat in his album cover. How do you feel about that? Right? So my students are having mad conversations back and forth about the reality of the purple, whether he's breaking gender norms or he's tokenizing. But the idea is the androgynous, Young Thug said about his own album cover, the androgynous identity of my inspirational garments reinforces my belief of no gender boundaries between men and women. There is no such thing as gender. Again, his name is Young Thug. Think about the early 90s when Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton were calling black people super predators, right? and then they ran as saviors for Black people, right? So let's have this conversation about the duality of society where people can grow. I'm sure that those people grew from a lot of their, quite frankly, racist thoughts about Black people from the 90s, especially because they want the Black vote. My favorite album cover is Death Certificate. A lot of people don't know that Ice Cube, right? This was the original cover. They made him change it and take the corpse out that says Uncle Sam. Ice Cube, when he released Death Certificate, was the #4 highest selling album on the Billboard 100 in 1990, October 19th, 1991. Yes, I know it like that, right? But because he was so offensive to the status quo, the hegemonic status quo of our society, Billboard decided not to include Ice Cube in their list, even though he had the 4th highest selling album. So you can have a conversation with your students about capitalism and the fact that capitalism is always racialized. Because even though he was making his white producers hella money, right, they still didn't allow him to be included on a list with a bunch of white rock and roll artists, pop stars, right? Why? Right? And then I have conversations with my students about the Transcontinental Telecommunications Act of 1997 that Bill Clinton signed, which was why the same 25 songs are played on your radio station, because big production companies that sell mainstream hip hop artists can buy time. And so the sort of the hidden gems in hip hop, the people who rap about things like, I don't know, institutionalized racism, don't have the same bank account cachet to buy airtime. And there's absolutely a racialized component to that. And so my students have this conversation where art and politics collide in the same way that during Kaepernick's sort of taking a knee protest, sports and politics collide, right? And so, people don't know that Sam Cooke wasn't allowed to include a lyric in Change Gonna Come about slavery. They told him to take it out the song, right? So I had a student from my dissertation research who wrote, "What a privilege your college students must have, Dr. D, to learn about racism from infographics and Venn diagrams. I had to learn about racism from being constantly tormented my whole life." And she's a Black girl. She identifies as a young Black woman, right? And so there's sort of a rhetorical, albeit tongue-in-cheek component to this, which is she is the expert. There is no culture of poverty because you, as a white researcher or teacher, are not in her shoes and you can't tell that story. However, you do have the tools and resources and, quite frankly, the cachet to create, again, the term that Michele used, to create the space in which you know her better. And as a result, your curriculum can be tailored to her, Kendall's experiences. And so with that, I'm going to go to the next slide real quick, which is when we talk to our students about sort of creating polemics in math, in art, in US history, in whatever subject you're teaching. So in San Francisco, ethnic studies is actually a requirement. All 9th grade teachers have to be trained on it, and all 9th grade students have to take it. And this is actually a slide from the train, because I trained the ethnic studies teachers in the San Francisco Unified. They hired me and a bunch of my colleagues from USF and Berkeley to teach them about how you teach ethnic studies. How do you teach the history of our people? And one thing that's really interesting from one of Michele's quotes is the teacher, I can't remember who it was, Michele, but she talked about we have to teach our students about their history, but it can't just stop at history. It also has to talk about how the history is living in sort of the postmodern era and how there's an afterlife to slavery. There's an afterlife to the Zoot Suit rights. There's an afterlife to the colonization of Puerto Rico, right? Which is called throwing toilet paper and paper towels at them as if they're people who are less than people from the mainland. Why is it so comfortable for our politicians to do that to people who are of Taino and Puerto Rican descent, right? Let's have that conversation and not just the conversation of how Puerto Rico was a colony, right? And so that's how I sort of create the margins between overt white supremacy, which is very simple, right? You teach your students about respecting each other, keep your hands to yourself, don't say the N-word, right? People show up in a clown outfit. It's very obvious that it's an incendiary and, quite frankly, violent response to a racialized situation. However, there's a covert and socially acceptable white supremacy that's far more ubiquitous and entrenched and institutionalized that we don't talk about. So an example would be last year, right? Wells Fargo was sued for $70 billion, which they were convicted of and are paying currently, because Black communities in the Midwest, I think in Chicago and different areas, were, when they controlled for credit score, Black families were not getting mortgage loans from Wells Fargo at the same rate as their model minority Asian and white counterparts who had the same credit score. And it was happening, to use Michelle's word again, disproportionately, right? So we can have that conversation in math class pretty easily, right? Could we have that conversation in art class? Could we have that conversation in U.S. history class? Could we have that conversation in Michelle, give me another class. I don't know, like science,
Yeah,
right?
like,
How cul-de-sacs were actually created so slave catchers could patrol when Black people walked into a street. That's actually why a lot of cul-de-sacs were created, right? People don't know this history, including white people. Let's have that conversation. Sorry to get a little hood on it. So these are things that we need to talk about, and these have absolutely social emotional impact. So something I want to talk about. 3 years ago, Harvard University did a study, and they found that students who have adverse childhood experiences, including in the classroom, are having a shelf life of 24 years less than their counterparts that didn't experience trauma in their K through 12 education, right? And this was a longitudinal study that was done over 50 years in Oakland. And they found that kids that lived 1.2 square miles away from kids in the Oakland Hills, where like Tom Hanks and a lot of the actors, the famous people in Oakland grew up, versus people in the east part of Oakland, which is quite frankly a food desert. You can't even find a drive-through in East Oakland. Everything's boarded up, right? Pre-Rona. There's a difference, shelf life, from 1.2 miles away of 24 years, right? So we could have a conversation about redlining that would apply to art, math, science, ethnic studies, and U.S. history. Why can't we take all those teachers, put them together in a lab class, have them teach what a lot of education schools are calling a youth action project, a youth participatory action project? And so what has come of this is a comprehensive approach that we're now doing. Thank you, Michelle. You're very intuitive. I didn't say it, my bad. Where we actually have lab model teachings where teachers take turns teaching the same class. So teachers actually have some days off where they're creating curriculum. And this is happening in a couple alternative schools in San Francisco Unified. And we're actually starting to scale it out across the Bay Area because it's working so well. We've seen our suspension rates decline by 30%. Michelle, can you go back? Sorry. We've seen our suspension rates decline by 30%, our attendance go up by 40% among a lot of our students that historically have dropped out, right? And that's our special education students, formerly incarcerated youth, or we say justice-involved students, and a lot of our foster kids. So what is that comprehensive approach? So we can actually skip the 3 words part, Michelle, and the parable of TC and all this, and just go straight to integration versus inclusion. Yeah. So the one before it. Right there. Thank you. So a lot of teachers sort of think about, well, I have Black students in my class, and I provide opportunities for them to do art about Black culture and the diaspora and things that are important to them. And so, but there's no sort of semblance of leadership, and that's sort of the crux of our praxis, which is creating opportunities in which students can not only tell their stories, but explain them and sort of grade themselves. Remember this idea of third space, right? So what they did in San Francisco is they created a restorative justice class where juniors and seniors have to take in order to graduate. And it's a pass, no pass class, right? And so what they've done in this class is create opportunities where students can take on civic issues or inequities, and all their teachers take turns once a week teaching it. And all 5 rests, there's 5 days a week, right? So Monday is the AP science teacher, Tuesday is the ethnic studies teacher, Wednesday is the counselor along with a community member. So we had Dr. Elaine Brown, who's a former Black Panther who works with a lot of formerly incarcerated Panthers. Thursday is the US history teacher, Friday is the math teacher. right? And so they take turns teaching this class where two students all have to work together on a single project. So when we did this project, we started in 2013, and that was sort of when Obama and folks were starting to finally respond. At that point, it had already been 5 years in. Finally, respond to the Flint issue, and that was also happening in Baltimore, where a lot of the schools had lead poisoning, the water was brown, and the plumbing system of the entire community was fraught with issues around toxic lead runoff from a lot of the industries that were either getting pushed out or gentrifying in, right? And so in our school in San Francisco, we created an urban garden. And in this urban garden, students wanted to know whether the soil they were using, especially with Silicon Valley being a hop and a skip away from a lot of these schools, students wanted to know whether the soil was clean enough to grow produce and so they could sell it at the Ferry Building in San Francisco and make a profit from it. So students actually, along with their AP chemistry teacher and ethics studies teacher, measured the topsoil for the pH, for the lead levels, and actually presented it to the former mayor of San Francisco, RIP, Ed Lee, who passed away recently. And they found that there was lead poisoning in San Francisco. There's articles about it. So we quickly transformed and found some justice. Within 2 weeks, Mayor Lee sent these kids free and clean orchard forklifts showed up to our school with like soil in bags for them to use for the urban garden. This is a way where students can not only make connections through visual text, because students were actually going around and asking their elders whether they should do an urban garden. And they were using their art to share what the community was saying about whether they should do an urban garden in the first place. But from there, they actually created one. But they didn't know whether the soil was clean. After their presentation, obviously all of them graduated to senior year. These were juniors. But now they have a stable urban garden where they can sell produce. They might have been poisoning their own community if they didn't do this project. Right? Imagine if ethnic studies only taught about redlining, but didn't teach about how redlining was impacting those kids' urban garden. That is the difference between an integration approach to teaching, where you're including the students in terms of space and philosophy, and an inclusion form of teaching, where students are actually stakeholders and the commandeers of the pedagogy, and the teachers, quite frankly, the facilitator. Remember, these kids had 5 teachers for one class. And that's what Michele and I were saying in the very, very beginning of our presentation when we said, why are these curriculums siloed? Why is Michele across the school from me teaching art and I'm teaching math, and there's no opportunity for students in my math class? Like she was saying, there's a lot of artists who don't take art to be able to explicate math through art or vice versa. You know what I mean? So from there, I want to show that there's 3 fallacies of justice-oriented teaching. And Dr. Ahmad Washington is actually one of my best friends. He and I, in 2016, wrote an article called The 3 Fallacies of Justice Research in Urban Education Journal. And just 3 bullet points of our long article is there's an ahistorical component to teaching where we think over time, racism is going to go away. And so we have to sort of just teach the history of racism. Sort of going back to that quote that Michele said from her teacher, which was, we have to go back and really teach the chronology, but not really think about the postmodern aspect of that chronology, right? And the example is, yeah, there was Jim Crow, but what is mass incarceration? A new form of Jim Crow, circa Michele Alexander. There's another fallacy where we think policy alone is going to change behavior, right? So we think zero tolerance policies around willful defiance is sort of thank you, Michele, is sort of this idea of like, I'm racially neutral. If a student pushes another student, we're neutral. Okay, let me share my research. For my master's research, I did a study on 600 referral forms in the San Francisco Unified of counselors. And there were counselors of all races. And I looked at, for the same transgression, Black and Latino students versus white and model minority Asian students. And the way that teachers wrote about the same transgression had a crimogenic component to it. And what I mean is a criminalizing one. So here's an example. Arash snatched Michele's headphones from her ear. For the white student, predominantly, the preponderance of the referral forms, the teacher wrote it objectively. So they would say, Arash took the headphones out of Michele's ears. For the Black or brown student, they literally wrote terms like larceny or theft. So there was a crimogenic component. So just because you have zero tolerance doesn't mean the way that it's applied isn't going to be racialized. And then finally, there's a great leader theory, is that if we just hire more Black police officers for schools and more Black teachers and more Black principals, we'll fix it. I call it the Obama theory, right? Racism over, we had a Black president, we strike, right? Rather than thinking about the inclusion piece, is okay, does that person actually represent the thoughts and conditions of the people that they purport to serve? So I know that we're going over time, so I'm just going to sort of fly through some of these and just share sort of, we can actually just skip that, Michelle. We can skip all these. But just go straight to the capoeira piece, because I want to wrap it up soon. But in the capoeira piece, I teach my students, so my critical hip hop studies class, I actually teach how hip hop is a conglomerate of all forms of expression and art and music. And it's malleable, right? For a long time, rap was just MCs speaking over beats. And Drake came along and a lot of other folks came along and started singing over rap songs, which changed a lot of the gender norms around men who can purport to be really macho singing over a hip hop beat. And I'm not even a Drake stan, but he still changed the game. And so I try to bring it back to this idea of or sort of the genesis of music. So capoeira has a very distinct beat and dance style, which is also a form of martial arts. But people don't realize that the beats from capoeira were actually coded signals that enslaved folks in Brazil were using to escape from their plantation owners. And so they were using the beat and it was coded language. So at 2 o'clock tonight, we're going to leave. Right? And so a lot of folks didn't know this, and that's how they bounced. That's how Brazil gained its independence. So capoeira was born from that. And so we can sort of skip the Macaulayism, but this idea of visual text, the next one, visual text and restorative justice, they're both geared towards change, not false promises. So there's monoculturalism. Michelle, can you go back? One more. Yeah, thank you. There's monoculturalism, which is the idea of the status quo. Multiculturalism, which is the idea of we're going to have ponchos in September. We're going to have in February, we're going to do all the Dr. King speeches and we're good, right? Check, check. But critical multiculturalism is the difference between restorative justice and transformative justice or visual text, where students are active stakeholders, where they tell their own stories, like Michelle's students. So we can go to the next slide. I don't know if I can play this or not. Michelle, does it play? It won't play. Okay. So this is a song that you can look up on YouTube. Mick Jenkins, Chicago. He's actually my favorite MC. He's a young cat from the South Side. But he did a song about being the only Black kid in his honors classes at the school he was bused to from the South Side of Chicago to the North Side of Chicago. And in that song, he doesn't know about he may not know. He doesn't say the terms double consciousness and stereotype threat. But he absolutely, through his hip hop art or visual text, through his music video that you guys can go watch, talks about double consciousness and stereotype threat. And so my students who are graduate students getting their masters and their EDDs, who are learning about double consciousness and stereotype threat, sadly, some of them for the first time, can learn about it through a 20-year-old hip hop song where he's saying, I felt like, what does he say in the song? He said, I feel like acne, a blackhead that needs to be popped, right? This idea of if I disband myself of my stereotypical Blackness, the teacher will call on me in class. That's what the song's about. That is 100% what W.E.B. Du Bois was talking about, right? So if we can go to the next one, Michelle. The 4 types of school-sanctioned violence. When we teach our students epistemic, physical, cultural, socio-political violence, that gets mad confusing, even for our teachers in my teacher credential program. But if we show them an ad from Dove, this is a visual text project I did with my students. So Michelle, if you can go to the next slide. This is a form of epistemic violence. Epistemic is just a fancy, newfangled word for words. So Dove said, our lotion is for normal to dark skin. I'll just pause right there. What is wrong with normal to dark skin? Like Cat Williams said, go ahead, I'll wait. Right? So this is a form of epistemic violence. So what I had my students do in my graduate students, which is akin to what Michelle does with her kids, is redo this ad. How would it be inclusive versus integrationist? They're including dark people, but they're integrating them. They're not being inclusive of them. So I would have my graduate students redo a visual text version of this ad that isn't epistemically violent to Black and brown people. Does that make sense? So hopefully that makes sense with folks, since I can't hear you. This next picture is a picture from my Whole Foods, which I call the flagship of gentrification, along with yoga stores and cupcake shops. I don't know why in my town we have a cupcake shop every 3 blocks, but that's what it is. So if you go into my Whole Foods, you take this picture, you got Greek, Polish, you want your bratwurst, you know what I mean? You got German, you got British, if you want some potatoes, you know what I mean? But Asian, which is, robust in this very large continent, is monoculturalized and reduced to just one aisle called Asian in the city of San Francisco. Again, I'll wait, right? So when you think about this, what kind of violence is this? This is socio-political. This is epistemic. This could even be physical because you feed yourself with the food. And this is cultural. This is all 4 forms of violence. So what I have my students do is redo what this aisle would look like that is divested from those 4 forms of violence. And you can use visual text. You can do it with grad students at USF, and you can do it with kids in the Buffalo Unified, right? So I hope I'm making my point. You can actually skip all this because there's no time. But there's just one last thing I'm going to end this on, which is an example of, Michelle and I really wanted to leave you guys with a lesson that you can use in the classroom. And Michelle liked this one, although I love all of hers, but I know she shared some. So I hope it's okay if I share this one. So Pac, who's one of my heroes, I had 3 pictures in my locker when I was a kid. I had a picture of Aaliyah, RIP, that was going to be my queen. I was going to marry her. I had a picture of Pac because I wanted to be a poet just like Pac, and I had a picture of the 6-foot hole that the Iraqi F-16 missile left in my house 2 months after my mom and I got our political asylum in the U.S. And so when I think about Pac, there's a song that he wrote, So Many Tears, where he says, back in elementary, I thrived on misery. Left me alone, I grew up amongst a dying breed. Inside my mind, I couldn't find a place of rest until I got that thug life tatted on my chest. And he wrote the word thug in the lyrics in all caps, and it's tattooed. Actually, he took some artistic liberties, not on his chest, but his abdomen. But thug life is an acronym, which stands for the hate you give little infants F's everybody. Guess what that is? That's Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory of violence in 1981. Pac was reading socio-political books. He didn't put it in nerdy terms, but he was absolutely explaining how ecological macro systems have microsystemic outcomes. So from there, I asked my students, my grad students, to brand their own identity and come up with their own sort of visual text if they were to tattoo themselves. And of course, not permanently, but again. So you can go to the next slide. Actually, the last slide, because Michelle sort of upgraded my work. Thank you, Michelle. But this is a gender neutral body where I asked my students to be, we wanted to be equitable with gender norms and bodies. So thank you, Michelle, for upgrading. But so the idea is come up with your own acronym and tattoos. And my students, future teachers who are killing the game right now in each of their respective schools, came up with the most amazing visual text on this assignment. This is absolutely an assignment Michelle and her teachers could do in Buffalo. Absolutely. The context might change, but again, the difference is, am I being integrationist or multicultural, or am I being critical multicultural and inclusive? And that's absolutely the point and the difference that I want to bring and really communicate to you all between restorative justice, where we're restoring the person, and transformative justice, where we're trying to transform the public narrative around issues and the actual issues themselves. And so with that, I want to bid you farewell. Thank you all for the opportunity. We will take questions. If you want to apply and send any articles to my journal, it's transformativejusticejournal.org, and my organization is SaveTheKidsGroup.org. If any of you want to do any work in your respective areas around the school to prison pipeline, we have chapters all over the country, and that's my email and Twitter page. Thank you, Michele.
Thank
Appreciate you.
you. And I also welcome, if you decide to venture into the world of visual journals and visual text, please send me some images. I would love to see that and have a conversation with you about what you came up with and what your students came up with. You know, this is really important work. You can see Arash's passion. I'm very passionate about this work too. And I think, you know, our students need our help. And they need to feel like they have a place to talk about issues that are important to them. And through this kind of work, we can do that for them. It's a very small thing that we could do for them, but it makes a really big difference. So we hope that you were able to garner something out of this conversation. And we're looking forward to hearing from you and your questions, and have a really great rest of your November.